Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. It was one of those nights in South Jersey where the mist clung heavy to the roads, thickening the shadows between the trees on either side. I was working the night shift, patrolling my usual route down the rural highways. The call log had been quiet for hours, which in this part of town was either a sign of peace or a promise of trouble brewing. It was around 3 a.m. when I noticed it, a car, parked just off the road, skewed awkwardly on the grass. What struck me first was that the driver's side door was open. No one leaves a car like that in the dead of night, especially not in the middle of nowhere. The street was unlit, only the pale moonlight cut through the thick fog rolling from the woods on either side. As I slowed my cruiser and pulled up behind the vehicle, I saw someone. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, stepped out from the passenger side and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the thick shadows without a backward glance. Something gnawed at me, an instinct, maybe, or the uncomfortable chill that had taken root in my spine. I reached for the radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. Got a vehicle, no plates, driver fled on foot into the woods. Requesting backup." Static crackled back, followed by an affirmative response. It would be a few minutes before anyone could get here, so I figured I'd better check out the vehicle in the meantime. My flashlight cut through the dense night as I approached, each step accompanied by a growing sense of dread that I couldn't quite shake. Peering into the car, the first thing that hit me was the smell. A thick, choking stench. Rotten, stale, heavy. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes long after you've left the scene. I knew that scent. I had encountered it on the worst days of this job. It was the smell of something dead, something decomposing. Then I saw them. Crumpled tissues and paper towels lay scattered across the passenger seat, smeared with what looked like dried blood. Not just a few drops. These were soaked, the reddish stains so dark they were nearly black. The front seat was littered with them, some even strewn across the back. The amount of blood I was looking at suggested serious harm, or worse. And then, from somewhere in the trees I heard it. A soft, eerie rustle, followed by the crunch of leaves, and then, a voice. Low, guttural, like someone trying to speak underwater. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was unmistakable. It sounded like someone in pain or in some other, darker state. The voice was too low to make sense of, but the intent chilled me. "Do you need help?" I called out, shining my flashlight into the murk between the trees. Silence. The only reply was the oppressive quiet of the forest and the occasional rustle of leaves. I radioed for more backup. Whatever this was, I was certain now that I was going to need all the support I could get. Just as I thought I'd seen the worst of it, something else caught my eye on the floor by the driver's seat. A bundle of what looked like a large cloth, soaked through with blood. I steeled myself, lifting it carefully with a gloved hand, and the cloth came away with a damp, heavy resistance. When I unwrapped it, I froze. There, lying cold and lifeless in my hands, was a severed hand. The edges were ragged, as though it had been hastily cut or torn away. Blood had congealed around the wrist, forming dark, hardened clots. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me, my heart hammering in my chest. This was beyond anything I had ever seen in my years on the force. I pulled my radio close, speaking quickly, my voice barely steady. "Dispatch, this is Reed. I've found a human hand. Severed. The situation is potentially homicidal. Immediate assistance required." While waiting for backup, I continued to search the vehicle. Apart from the blood-soaked tissues in the hand, there was little else of note. No wallet, no ID, no clues that might tell me who had left this macabre scene behind. The car was confirmed stolen from a nearby town, but when I reached out to the owner, she had no idea who might have taken it. She hadn't even noticed it was missing. When backup finally arrived, we combed through the woods with flashlights, tracking dogs, and all the manpower we could summon in the dead of night. The dogs led us in circles, stopping short of anything useful. Hours passed, the dawn creeping over the treetops, Yet we found no trace of blood leading from the vehicle, no further evidence, no footprints, and certainly no sign of the driver. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the forest itself. Forensics took over the vehicle, and they ran prints and DNA from the severed hand. The results were baffling. The fingerprints didn't match any on record, and there was no DNA match in any database. It was as if this hand had belonged to someone who didn't exist, someone with no history, no background. Weeks passed, then months, and every lead evaporated. The case went cold, and we were left with nothing but unanswered questions. I could feel the weight of the night bearing down on me as I took my seat for another graveyard shift at the Bergen County Police Department. The air inside the station was still, almost too quiet, like the kind of calm that only comes before a storm. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, almost mocking my boredom, and I settled in, half hoping the night would pass without incident. But that was rarely the case. Sometime around 2 in the morning, the call came in, a frantic voice on the other end of the line reporting screams coming from a house out near the edge of town. It was one of those calls that sets your adrenaline going even before you've left the station. I knew I'd be alone on this one, at least until I could call in backup. I drove the familiar winding roads, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The house was a 2-story place, tucked back from the road, shrouded in the shadows of tall, overgrown trees that loomed like sentinels. Everything about it felt wrong. The windows were dark, no lights inside, but there was one thing that caught my eye, a single window at the back, slightly ajar. I parked the cruiser, grabbed my flashlight, and radioed in for backup. The waiting silence around me was almost deafening. When I got closer to the house, the unease grew stronger. The front door was locked, as were the windows on the main level. But the one in the back, open just a crack, was practically inviting me inside. I climbed through, careful not to make too much noise, and landed softly on the carpeted floor of what looked like a living room. The air was thick with a smell I couldn't place, something stale, mingled with a faint metallic tinge. I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "This is Officer Thompson with the Bergen County PD. Is anyone home?" Nothing. Just that oppressive silence. My flashlight scanned the room, revealing little more than outdated furniture, the edges gathering dust, and a few family photos on the wall, barely visible in the shadows. I moved through the ground floor, one room at a time. Kitchen, empty. Dining room, empty. Den, nothing but an eerie quietness. It wasn't until I reached the staircase that I heard something, a soft, almost imperceptible creak from above. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to stay calm. It could have been anything, a draft, an old floorboard, maybe even an animal. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Taking each step cautiously, I made my way up the stairs. The second floor was dimly lit by a faint glow spilling in from a streetlight outside, casting elongated shadows along the narrow hallway. 4 doors lined the walls, each closed. I held my breath, my grip tightening on the flashlight as I moved closer. Another creak came from behind the door at the end of the hall. I paused, heart pounding, and took a deep breath before slowly turning the handle. The door opened with a soft groan, and the smell hit me first, iron and something sharper, something unmistakably wrong. My flashlight fell upon the bed, and I froze. A woman lay there, her face pale, blood seeping through the blankets that covered her. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, and her eyes fluttered open, wide with fear. She'd been stabbed, multiple times, judging by the red stains that had soaked through the sheets. "Ma'am, stay with me," I whispered, moving closer. "I'm calling for help." But something made me stop. A sound, so faint I almost missed it, a rustling coming from beneath the bed. I swallowed hard and crouched down, my flashlight angled just so, to peer underneath. There, lying in the shadows, was a man, his face obscured by a cheap, expressionless mask, his body coiled like a predator waiting to strike. The flashlight beam caught his eyes behind the mask, glinting with something cold and unhinged. Without a second thought, I drew my weapon, aiming it directly at him. "Get out from under the bed. Now." He didn't move. I could see his chest rising and falling, hear the faint, controlled breaths he was taking. I repeated myself, voice as steady as I could make it. "Hands where I can see them, now." Slowly, he started to move, unfolding himself from under the bed in one fluid, unsettling motion. He stood, looming taller than I'd expected, and I kept my gun trained on him as he took a step back toward the corner of the room. "You stay right there," I ordered, the gun feeling heavier in my hands than it ever had before. He didn't resist, just stood there, his masked face turned toward me, watching with an unnerving stillness. The woman on the bed let out a weak moan, and I forced myself to focus, my gaze flickering between her and the man in the mask. The minutes stretched out, each one feeling like an eternity, until finally, I heard the blessed sound of sirens approaching. Backup was here. When my colleagues arrived, we officially cuffed the man and tended to the woman. She was barely conscious but still breathing. I remember looking at her pale face as the paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher, wondering how anyone could survive something like that. Later, as we took the man into custody, the story began to unfold. He was her boyfriend, or had been, until recently. He'd found out she was seeing someone else, a mutual friend, and in his twisted mind, he saw only one way to resolve the betrayal. He'd waited until he was certain she was alone, breaking in and confronting her, hoping to scare her at first, maybe only to make her feel the pain he felt. But rage had taken over, and things escalated. When she tried to end things over the phone earlier that night, he'd snapped completely. In that dark room, he became someone else, someone willing to do the unthinkable. And yet, even after all that, she lived. It was nothing short of a miracle. The doctors later told us she'd been stabbed 6 times, each one intended to end her life, but somehow she'd held on. I think back to that night sometimes, to the moment I found her, and the way my heart stopped when I saw him under the bed, hiding in the shadows, waiting. The image of his eyes behind that mask still haunts me, that sick gleam that told me he'd been ready to kill again if anyone got in his way. That night taught me the fragility of life, the thin line between safety and danger. It also reminded me of the darkness that can lurk in anyone, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. It was late, and I'd been patrolling the quieter part of town, where things are usually so calm that the night drags on. But just as I was about to wrap up my shift, dispatch radioed in. There was a call from a woman, young and living alone. She'd reported a break-in, a window smashed downstairs, though nothing seemed to be missing. What struck me odd was how nervous the dispatcher sounded. They told me the call had abruptly cut off. The woman, Kara, they said, hadn't picked up since, and any attempts to call her back went straight to voicemail. I drove to her address, a 2-story house set back from the road, with a cluster of trees crowding around it, giving it an eerie feel under the streetlight. The silence out here was thick. No movement, no sound. Not even a dog barking. I parked a bit away from the house, switched off the headlights, and approached the front door. I knocked several times, calling out, "Police! Kara, it's Officer Mason. Are you okay?" No answer. Just the faintest rustle in the air. Walking around the side of the house, I found a window smashed. A small, tight window leading into what looked like a basement or storage room. Glass littered the ground, shining in the moonlight like a scattered handful of broken stars. I had a choice. Protocol would say I wait for backup, but something didn't sit right with me. This didn't feel like a typical break-in. The quiet was too loud, too complete. And Kara, well, she could be in danger. I climbed through the broken window, careful to step over the shards, my heart thumping louder than I'd ever admit. Once inside, I drew my gun and announced myself, loud and clear. "This is the police. If anyone's here, show yourself." No response. Moving through the downstairs area, I noticed the furniture looked undisturbed. Nothing was overturned, no signs of rummaging. Odd for a break-in. I kept sweeping each room, moving carefully but quickly. That's when I heard it, a faint creak, the kind of sound that travels through walls, through floorboards, especially in older houses like these. The sound came from above. Upstairs. I felt my pulse quicken. Kara had mentioned hearing footsteps before the call cut off. I took a breath, quieted my nerves, and slowly ascended the staircase, keeping my steps light and my senses sharp. The upstairs hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit from a single lamp in the far room. I could see her bedroom door ajar, a soft glow of light spilling out onto the carpet. I approached, peering in cautiously, and found her, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, face pale as moonlight. Her eyes snapped up to mine, wide and terrified, like a deer caught in headlights. "Kara?" I whispered, lowering my gun slightly. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, not speaking, not even breathing it seemed, just sitting there, tense and frozen. When I asked her why she didn't respond to the calls, her voice came out barely above a whisper. I didn't want him to know," she stammered. "I thought he'd hear." My stomach twisted. She wasn't alone. And whoever had broken in was still here. I glanced around the room, searching for any signs of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. But everything seemed still, eerily so. I gestured toward the closet, and her eyes darted there momentarily, before her gaze dropped to the floor, settling just beside the bed. I felt a chill run down my spine as I followed her gaze. She gave the faintest nod, just enough for me to understand. Someone was hiding beneath her bed. My mind raced. I couldn't let on that I knew, and I had to get her out of there without triggering any suspicion from whoever was lurking below. Thinking quickly, I asked her to come with me to fill out a report. Told her I needed her signature on some paperwork downstairs. She caught on immediately, standing slowly. I could see her hands trembling as she moved, her eyes never leaving mine as she approached. I stepped aside, letting her slip past, and the second she was clear, I spun back to the bed, gun drawn. "Come out, now!" I barked, voice carrying the weight of authority, trying to mask the slight shake in my hands. Silence. And then, from the shadowy depths beneath the bed, a shuffling sound, slow and deliberate. A man, dressed in all black, slid out on his stomach, hands raised, a glint of something metallic in his grip. I barked another order, and he dropped the weapon, a small handgun, that clattered onto the floor. He was middle-aged, unshaven, with a hollow, wild look in his eyes. The kind of look that makes your blood run cold. Backup arrived shortly after, and the man was cuffed, taken out into the night while Kara stood in a daze, watching from the doorway, her face pale and drained. I stayed with her as she spoke to another officer, recounting how she'd discovered the broken window, how she'd hoped it was a fluke until she started hearing the footsteps, those slow, creeping footsteps that had haunted her from below while she huddled in fear. She explained, too, why she hadn't answered when we tried to call back. She was afraid her voice would carry. Afraid that he'd realize she wasn't alone in her fear. The thought that her silence, her deliberate calm, might have kept him from acting sooner hit me hard. As I left her house that night, walking through the quiet, empty rooms one last time, I thought of the man hiding under her bed, lurking just inches away as she sat above him, terrified.